Today, we're going to speak with a very esteemed panel representing both state and local and federal law enforcement asset management organizations. This panel will have individuals from Department of Justice as well as Homeland Security, and then state and local within the New York metropolitan area. We convened a law enforcement asset management working group approximately 2 years ago with the idea of bringing together best practices and collaboration across an industry that shares a lot of commonalities within agencies and across agencies and departments, as well as within the state and local environment. When we kicked off the working group, we decided that we should start an effort known as a sector asset leadership strategy, which essentially brings together the thought leadership, identifies trends, best practices, and common problems so that collaboration can occur organically across different federal agencies. Today, we are going to present the findings of a 12-month effort to develop a sector asset leadership strategy for law enforcement asset management. And then we will also have a panel discussion with representatives on some of the challenges and best practices that we're hearing today. So I am going to turn it to my colleague, Jonathan Schneider, a manager with Grant Thornton, to walk us through some of the findings of the sector asset leadership strategy. John?
Yeah, there's the mute button. Thanks, Moshe. As Moshe said, my name is John Schneider, manager in Grant Thornton Public Sector team focused on asset management and supply chain. And for about the last 5 years or so, been spending a lot of time working in the law enforcement world, particularly in DHS. In our collaboration and work with ALN, Moshe and I, working with Mike and the team, really for what Moshe said, the past 2+ years maybe, on different efforts related to the national asset leadership strategy and the sector strategy that we'll talk through today. So I'll spend the next 10 minutes or so kind of going through some of the findings from this work, and hand over to Moshe again to go through the panel. All right. So before we go into the details of the law enforcement sector strategy that is the topic of today's discussion, I wanted to take a step back a bit and talk about the national asset leadership strategy. And so the national asset leadership strategy was work that we conducted with ALN around in 2020 and early 2021, and it really resulted in this document that was submitted to the Biden transition team in January that outlined a decision support organizational framework, essentially to improve asset management in the US, and really stress the importance of the ISO 55000 standards. What's not on the screen here, and you'll see is a kind of overview of what that document was, is what our slogan for the document was. And the slogan was, structural problems require structural solutions. So that was really the goal of this document and the goal of the overarching national asset leadership strategy and these sector strategies that we're going to be talking about today. And so really to stress the importance of a government-wide solution to these structural problems really impacting asset management community. And then on the right side of the screen here, you'll see some of the benefits that we try to tout in this document for this national strategy. That's benefits from informed asset investment decisions to overall improved efficiency and effectiveness, and lastly, just overall better life cycle asset management. So that's really where we started at national level, and what we'll talk to today is more the sector level discussions we've had. So going on to the next slide here. So what is the SALS, or the sector asset leadership strategy? And so what this really is a way to assist and promote a sector-based adoption of these national asset management strategies that I just talked about. So our team with ALN developed a template for capturing this sector level information that really builds on this framework that we outlined in last year. And so this template is called the Sector Asset Leadership Success Structure. And part of that is 22 different questions that hit across these topics you see on the screen to really gauge industry leaders, guide industry leaders through these discussions, kind of as part of these working groups that Moshe mentioned, law enforcement, is to really start this conversation and how do we tailor these national goals for asset management to a sector like law enforcement. Pretty much what it does is try to take these principles of a national asset leadership strategy to the sector level. And so, like Moshe said, we've been working a lot with the law enforcement sector to do this, and we've also done this with the healthcare sector. And so the next few slides will kind of walk through some of our findings for these discussions and kind of what the outputs of these 22 different questions were. So what we started with is really defining the sector up front, kind of understanding what the current state was. And I think a unique aspect or topic that we discussed for law enforcement is, probably pretty known to this group, but not so maybe people outside of the sector, is just the breadth and size of the law enforcement asset management sector. I think the statistic is pretty interesting from 2016, there being 132,000 full-time law enforcement officers across the federal government. That really ranges from DHS to DOD to civilian agencies. It's obviously countless more when you look at the state and local world as well. And so on the screen here is some of the key challenges and strengths that we discussed, and kind of hit a couple of main themes throughout our meetings. So looking at the challenges, the key ones being just the life cycle management, being able to track assets across the world throughout its entire life cycle and be able to maintain high quality data quality throughout that. Another is just continuously adopting new enabling technologies to support those efforts. And then the bottom three are kind of around just building a standardized process for doing these activities, building a standardized training program, standardizing accountability across the asset lifecycle. And so those are kind of the main things that came up in terms of challenges. And then on the right side, you'll see what some of the strengths were. One of them, I think some of these speak to overcoming those challenges on the left side. One of those being the ongoing efforts to increase technology, and particularly mobile tracking systems, into the technology landscape of the sector. The next three on the right, strong workforce, increased collaboration, professionalism, kind of hit a similar theme of the strong workforce across the sector, the increase in collaboration between agencies and within agencies. And then the last one, professionalism, is something we talked about, I think, with all of our different working groups, is the move to professionalize the sector, understanding the priority and importance of these activities in the asset management world. That's not just a collateral duty for individuals. And the last one is the scalability systems, being that systems in place currently can really scale just to the breadth that this sector really presents. Great. And so those are kind of how to set the scene for the sector. And then we started to discuss a bit about who are the key stakeholders, and any unique stakeholders in this sector compared to others in the federal or state and local space. So some of these probably obviously are going to impact any government agencies. Internal stakeholders like frontline officers, headquarters staff, agency leadership, department leadership. And then we also spent a lot of time talking about external stakeholders. And I think in particular, we talked about something unique within the law enforcement world is a lot of agencies have international presences, or in coordinating with, whether that be State Department as an external stakeholder, or foreign governments, or even just frontline workers or frontline officers that are stationed internationally, present unique challenges in the asset management world. And then one thing in particular in the bottom right, you'll see is the general public, obviously a very important stakeholder across the federal government. And one thing that I think is new and that we had discussed is just the increased insight that the general public now has into the day-to-day operations of law enforcement, and how that relates to new asset innovations that are taking place. When we look at body-worn cameras, for example, as an asset that we had discussed as being an innovation in the asset management world that may kind of relates to that stakeholder in particular. So a lot of interesting discussion here kind of about what are the unique stakeholders for this sector in particular. And so now understanding kind of who's this current state and who the stakeholders are, we spent a lot of time in these working sessions discussing what are the overarching objectives of the sector and kind of what does that mean in the details. And in bold here, as always, what it came back to is the primary mission of the sector is to ensure that frontline officers are equipped to meet any agency's law enforcement or national security mission. And really, all those items below the bold are different objectives that support that overall mission, that overarching objectives. And so whether that's efficient asset tracking, accountability over the full life cycle, data-driven decision-making, those all kind of feed up to that overarching objective of the agency, of the sector. And one thing we talked about here a bit as well is the objective of balancing the need for strategic accountability, taking the time to ensure that all the accountability processes are completed, while also presenting things timely to those frontline officers to meet those missions. So I think these are some of the highlights that we talked about. Right. And so I think this will be the last slide here, and I'll hand it back to Moshe to get into the panel discussion. But so we ended our discussions usually discussing how do we track the benefits and how do we manage performance in the sector. And so these are three of the main things that came up over and over in our discussions. The first is using industry benchmarks, and ASTM is one that came up over and over again as a good standard to use to measure performance for the sector. The next is the ISO 55000 principles, and the main one being the development of a strategic asset management plan, and really using that as a framework to develop performance measures and develop that process and that governance model to manage performance into the future. And then the last one is data quality standards. And so using these standards to really ensure that there is high quality data in the throughout the asset management lifecycle to ensure that you can make strong data-driven decisions, really the backbone of a lot of the different analysis analytics that takes place throughout the whole life cycle of asset management. And so that was kind of a quick overview of some of our findings from our discussions and what's kind of embedded in the law enforcement sector plan. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Happy to discuss and provide you a little more detail. But with that, I will hand it back over to Moshe.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks for running through the presentation. I'll also say that we developed a document that captures this information in greater detail. That document will be shared with all the attendees. So you'll have a lot more fidelity and information in each of these different aspects. This was just a high-level summary. And I also want to give great shout out to John and the team who have been feverishly putting all of the input together to create the documents, go through various iterations, review, send it back out to stakeholders. So just fantastic work for those that have been supporting. If Spence, Ben are also on, and Ed Safdie, thanks for the work. Okay, we'll move to the speakers, and I'll, as I introduce you, you can come on camera. The first is from Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. Nicole Johnson is the Chief of Staff for the Office of Facilities and Asset Management. Thank you, Nicole, for joining. The next is Charlie Ford from Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, who oversees the Facilities and Asset Management Office there. And then we have two representatives from the Department of Homeland Security, Kimon Fevrier, who's a program analyst in mobile assets and personal property in the Personal Property Policy and Oversight Office of the Chief Readiness Support Officer. Thanks for joining, Kimon. And then Porscha Porter, who's also a program analyst within the Personal Property Policy and Oversight Office as the National Utilization Officer in the Office of the Chief Readiness Support Officer of DHS. And then last but not least, Francia Henry from New York City Metropolitan Transit Authority Police and Security Division. So just a fantastic cross-section of representatives from the law enforcement asset management community. And as we go through these questions, I'll we'll use the same order of introduction so that we can organize our responses, but feel free to weigh in. So, the world is so much different today than 2 years ago when we started the Law Enforcement Asset Management Working Group. And we've now are transitioning to a new normal in a COVID-19 environment. So the first question is, what does the new normal look like from your asset management perspective? And Nicole, or would you prefer Nikki, Nicole?
You can say Nikki. Everybody knows me.
All right, perfect. Well, Nikki, you want to take that first, then we'll go to Charlie and Kimon next.
Sure. So obviously we've had some huge changes within ICE. Specific to assets, I'm going to kind of be a little more general. I'm responsible for the asset and facilities management division, but where we've really taken a different approach overall for an agency is we're working on, and I'm leading the workforce transformation initiative, which is basically changing how we work in the future. And it's not just facilities, it's technology, and it's human capital. So we're revising our telework and remote work policies. We're improving our technologies, because without these types of avenues, we wouldn't be able to communicate because we're all at home. And then we're also changing our actual facilities footprint, where we are, doing more consolidation efforts. We are doing more hoteling, reservation systems, and so on. Currently, within the NCR region, we have moved out of one of the 3 offices that we occupy, and we actually moved 412 employees from the Tech World facility and integrated them into PCN. Now, that is pretty easy to do because everybody's working at home right now. But we had to go through a serious effort of decommissioning the assets and trying to work through that in a mobile environment has presented its challenges. Very fortunate that our OCIO group is being very supportive, but we definitely have some room for improvement in the future. Going back, whatever that looks like, I don't believe it will not be what we were before. We will have to change our mindset, and that's a cultural change, especially for a law enforcement agency. But the majority of our workforce, at least on the support side, has been max telework. We have relied on technology very much to make that an effective measure for our agency.
Thank you, Nikki. Charlie, you want to go next?
Sure. So our new world is basically shifting from a centralized management perspective to a decentralized perspective. Right now, well, past years, forever, we've centrally managed everything from DC when it comes to asset management and logistics coordination and those. We realize, we can't sustain that. We're just not where we need to be to provide flexibility, to scalability, things like that. So really, we're working now to take and distribute our headquarters workforce out across the field. Now we're doing that through contracting, because you can't just take a government employee and say, oh, I know you signed up to work in Washington, D.C., but tomorrow you're going to be working in Dallas, Texas, right? So we're transitioning all of that through contract support. But with that, we realized we needed more robust technology. It was pretty easy with one simple asset management system to do a few things because we had processes in place like that. So we've really invested a lot in our fleet management systems, our asset management systems, and implementing document management systems, everything, and trying to integrate it. So when we do send people out to the field, they're available. But if something else happens, they can work from home. They can work from pretty much anywhere. So adding technology is number one. And number two that we focus on is decentralizing operations, putting it closer to where the work needs to be done.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You hear the common theme of, technological enablement, interoperability, quite frankly, because of where people and law enforcement agencies have to work, officers, agents in the field. That's fantastic. Thank you both. Kimon, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. So the new normal when we talk about asset management, to me, it's just still being defined, right? Because things are still, from my perspective, things are still changing. But one thing I do think when we talk about asset management, what the personnel or the community still remains committed and or hurdles that we have encountered over the last year and a half. But what I do know is the new normal is no longer business as usual. What we thought once of asset management, the posture that we have now changed, especially within the last 20 months. We've been more or less placed in the forefront when we talk about PPE, that, you know, everybody knows about PPE, and electrification, when we talk about electrifying fleet. Now our expertise and our experiences are now being brought forth to, like I said, from my perspective, on the department level, which has been needed in the past, but sometimes our circumstances change. And now where we are now is just trying to be agile in this industry. Just, you know, whatever change or whatever needs that may be there, we're able to adapt to that and change as the, you know, wind blows. So that's from my perspective.
That's great, Kimon. And you know, I think in some cases there's almost a perfect storm in that with COVID-19, it forced forced new supply chains, new assets, and consumables to be, you know, brought into the ecosystem, PPE, for example, in serious management. At the same time, we had a change of administration, change of priorities. So you mentioned electrification,
Exactly.
right? And a massive change to the infrastructure and the environment while operating in a hybrid state, right? Where we're not sure, you know, what we're going to look like down in the future. So at the same time, perhaps it enables that transition. It can be a forcing factor as you're looking at consolidating operations in some cases, because more of the personnel are working remotely, you know, taking advantage of that consolidation to make electrification changes. On the other hand, you're still trying to maintain operations and have, you know, PPE out in the field for law enforcement organizations. So that was a great points. Porscha, would you like to go next?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right, perfect. So the new normal, well, no commuting, that's everybody, but as far as property management goes, I think it more so looks like creating more innovative ways to reduce any type of manual input that we're doing to strengthen accountability or our verification methods, as well as what comes to mind is an audit trail, right? Because we have a lot of movement of equipment right now going home, which has been before because people had standardized telework equipment, but just making sure that it's properly documented is what we want to do. And also properly return, because you want to get this equipment back, have it sanitized, and just have, you know, the deposition activities go. But the new normal, we still have a mission, you know, that doesn't stop. And it's just, we all in DHS, all the components, we just have a unique mission, even though they're different per component. But during the early days of COVID-19, I was still with ICE. And we did just that when we were there, myself and my partner, Kimon, creating some innovative ways by doing inventory by exception. So that method was mobile verification and different ways to be able to confirm that you had that asset, whether it was FaceTiming, taking a picture, doing things of that nature. But what we did was kind of lift the administrative burden off of the field offices, not having to account for throwing out a number here. I believe it was 20,000 or so out of 200,000 that we validated that way. But it was just a lifting that administrative burden with facilities being closed, because that was a big issue for us. And so kind of just had to think on our feet and rise to the occasion, so to speak, but got it done.
Yeah, I think that some fantastic points you brought up. In this remote environment, still being able to meet accountability requirements. And with in law enforcement, when you have highly sensitive assets located throughout the country or throughout a metropolitan area, finding creative ways to ensure that there's accountability of those assets and readiness to achieve the mission, since everyone's not on location, and such innovative work that you've all done in that arena. All right.
Thank you.
Francia.
Yeah, so first let me clarify, I don't work for New York City, I work for the MTA. Big rivalry there, so I always got to clear that up. So in our regards, in the spirit of transformation and seeing how we could better operationalize our existing resources, we have a unique perspective in terms of looking at our assets globally across agencies. So we have 7 law enforcement agencies within the MTA, and that doesn't include our external partners, which are federal and also local law enforcement agencies. And one good example that I like to share is with our video data sharing. So in looking at the existing enterprise of our assets for video data resources, so cameras, resources for sharing, reviewing video and things to that effect, and all of the supporting infrastructures for that, we didn't have a comprehensive resource to look at everything that we had in our inventory and in our existing assets that we could use more efficiently. So during COVID over the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of accountability for looking at what exists and then what are the needs that we're requesting additional funds for. In doing so, you have to substantiate what you already have on the books and explain why you're using something the way you have, and maybe why you're not using it to the maximum effectiveness. So that really helped us to take a step back and see how we can work better together, and also work with partner agencies through our enterprise to look at better ways to utilize our existing resources. So we have a unique approach to looking at the future now. So based on that assessment and then using data to inform our decision-making practices moving forward, we are using a more scientific approach to not just responses to our needs, but better budgeting, better allocation of our resources, and also staffing, which is in very high demand these days, and it's hard to hire people. So we've been busy.
Wow, that I think everything you said, I just see nods across the screen because of facing the same challenges, trying to achieve a lot of the similar outcomes. Data-driven decision making, evidence-based decision making is a big mantra within the federal sector, and then collaboration across law enforcement arenas. And what you had pointed out regarding utilization and better sharing of assets, better decision making of utilized or underutilized assets to be able to fulfill the mission effectively. All of those key points, I think, resonate for both the state and local, as well as the federal area. And that brings me actually segues really nicely to the next question. So the goal of the law enforcement asset management leadership strategy was to bring law enforcement asset management components together to collaborate on a shared vision, and I think we've put it together within this documentation. So how have you seen collaboration amongst law enforcement components change over the past 24 months? If so, where have you seen the largest area of collaboration? We'll go in the same order. I think Francia, you actually provided a nice transition to that, but we'll go back to Nikki and then we'll work our way back.
Oh, so I get to go first for all these questions. All right.
Well, you know what's coming, so.
So, biggest change, let's see, technology. I mean, again, what I kind of mentioned from the beginning is, without trying to, stop operations altogether for the people that are remote working from home, without Microsoft Teams or Zoom or any of these other technologies that allow us to communicate. I mean, that's the biggest change that I have seen. And it was kind of like a culture shock to some employees. When you go to the office, you see people, but we had some pushback on people wanting to use the cameras and different things like that to collaborate. So it's a culture change that we are still adjusting to. When it comes to using technology, especially for employees that have a lot of seniority, that have, that may in the past have struggled with technology, and trying to get them up to speed and using these tools that they haven't necessarily been forced to use in the past to be able to do their job. So,
yeah. And one additional spin I want to put on this question. So from a collaborative environment, I know, personally having experience in most components across DHS, within PPE, there was a significant amount of collaboration that we saw on PPE management. Were there other areas that you've noticed that collaboration has increased over the past 24 months amongst other components?
PPE, definitely. I don't think that we would have been successful in that program area if we didn't have that collaboration across the other agencies, lessons learned, and learning from each other to improve. I think our fleet program probably had an increase in collaboration with other agencies as well. And certainly, our facilities program has as well.
Yeah. Charlie?
So collaboration across the LE sector, I think it's kind of gone two different ways for us. Is we didn't used to spend a lot of time dealing with our counterparts in federal law enforcement. Now, though, because of some of the new challenges and new ideas and things that we need to do things better and smarter as we transition through the COVID period, is we talk regularly, like never before with our partners. Just yesterday, I was talking to U.S. Marshal Services and how they do fleet management and vehicle purchases and reporting and accountability and analysis. How are they doing that? 2 months ago, I was on the phone with DEA, and we were talking about how, what are some of the things that we're doing from a facilities asset management perspective, fleet perspective, contracting perspective, and just the whole gamut, right? Because we're like, how do we not reinvent the wheel, right? What have you done? Because there's problems I have that we're addressing. There's problems they're having. Well, now we've come to the point, we've solved a lot of those problems or have a plan that now we can start sharing. So we pretty regularly talk to each other now. My contracting, head of contracting that works for me, they were just talking to their counterpart in another federal law enforcement agency on some issues. So it's really increased the collaboration for us. And I would say the second part of it, though, is because I don't just view it as full-time employees working for government. This is a good example, just since we've been doing this, there's 2 people on the phone now, on the line now. The panel actually is that I've worked with in other agencies in the past, right? One's a contractor, one worked with me over at CBP. And so by coming together now, I just realized today, one of them is in a different position with another agency that I can touch base with, right? But I was looking at who dialed in. Some of our contractors are on the line right now for that too. So we're learning from them, and by them, working at CBP and then working with us, knowing people working over at other agencies that I've worked with before, talking to me, that's expanded my network. Some of this I wouldn't have known, that was available and be able to when I'm working with some of the contractors to draw upon that experience that they got somewhere else, right? So I kind of view, just since the ALN stuff, since we started that a couple of years ago, it's really progressed to expand the network even more. The COVID stuff expanded our network internally to DOJ, right? But externally through doing things like this, and just through that whole entire professional asset leadership and law enforcement career field, I guess you could say, it really has brought people together to be able to learn from each other and to collaborate more.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and great to hear that collaboration, even within DOJ, across the different components and agencies has increased, and that we're breaking down boundaries that, and quite frankly, artificial boundaries that existed in the past. Maybe some of that's technology driven, or just a cultural change in forums like this, where it shows a need for collaboration, and how quickly, best practices can be shared. Thanks, Charlie. Kimon, would you like to share next on collaboration? Oh, I think we lost audio again, Kimon. No. We might switch over to, oh wait, we might be able to hear you now. Why don't you
Can you hear me?
Perfect, we got you now.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
So I would say over the last year and a half, I've seen at a department-wide for DHS, where there has been a drastic shift in the culture, where a culture of innovation has been, or I would say continues to be promoted and supported. Whereas innovation comes sometimes with money, and budget. And sometimes when you talk about the federal government, that budget, especially when we talk about for asset management, it's to get the type of innovation we do need the support. And when we talk about money, right? But I have seen where the partnership and collaboration among DHS components, I know we've encouraged, and when I say we, me and my colleague, Porscha, we have encouraged that partnership and collaboration across DHS and its components. And you do sense where they now have more freedom, or maybe more empowered to explore, maybe new ideas that has led into the cross-sharing within DHS, other government, and other government agencies. So, and I think more or less people feel more comfortable, and I don't know why the change. I can't pinpoint why the change is, because that's something that I know for Porscha and I from ICE, we've always liked to engage with our program offices within ICE, but as well as other components and how they're handling different assets, how they're handling, maybe specific to law enforcement assets. How do you categorize those sensitivities? How do you manage it? If you don't need it, we'll acquire it. So we've always done that, but we have seen, or I've seen that shift where with the innovation comes with more collaboration amongst all the components. So, which is great, so.
Yeah, and I think what has happened too is maybe a larger unity of effort, right? Where there's a specific, whereas different organizations were previously operating independently,
Yes.
that unity of effort has strengthened because of perhaps this external change.
Yes, I agree. I definitely agree with that.
Cool. Porscha, would you like to go next?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, great. Gotta do a sound check. As far as collaboration, I would say we've seen from the headquarters level, DHS, I would say safeguarding of sensitive equipment, as far as increased controls, because one of the things we do is we do program management reviews where we meet with particular components to be able to see what they're doing. Not an audit, we don't like to call it audit, but to assess the health of the personal property program. And one of the things what was brought up to us was increased controls over sensitive equipment, but as well as training, but not just training, mandatory training, right? For property personnel. Another collaboration effort I've seen was more around kind of best practice, right? So like Kamal mentioned, information sharing. What are you doing over there at USCIS, so to speak, or CBP, Coast Guard? Just kind of finding those commonalities, but also finding what are they doing differently that we can kind of adapt. So it's great to find those. As far as another thing that comes to mind is collaboration on any report or survey efforts. So things surrounding the loss or damage of government property has also been brought up a lot through collaboration and automation around that reporting as well. So that's all that comes to mind on collaboration.
That's fantastic. That was a lot, a lot that came to mind. Appreciate you sharing, Porscha. All right, Francia.
Yeah, so I have two extremes. One is very simple, which is just how we communicate. So I think to Nicole's point initially, talking about technology and how some folks had a hard time getting used to it. We have a range of generations that exist in our field. So some people are a lot more comfortable with technology. So getting people to use Teams and Zoom as opposed to meeting in person, which before to have meetings for a project and to continue collaborating, you had to schedule these meetings in person at different geographical locations, which incurred costs, travel costs, whether people were driving, flying, going to different parts of not just the state, but the tri-state for us here in New York, and then also across the country and even globally. So it required a lot of time and planning. And, now we plan a meeting just by sending out a meeting invite based on people's availability, and it's done in 2 days, or, if not, within a. So there's that. And even though it's simple, it saved a lot of time in getting things done because we were able to meet not just more efficiently, but more frequently to continue the momentum of whatever projects we had going on. And then the other, I would say, is having to be forced to collaborate more often in addressing COVID-related issues. We were better at planning and executing tasks and projects, because before we really only planned to operationalize things for emergency. So emergency management, emergency planning, God forbid something terrible happened. We were all forced to work collaboratively with our partners. But now, being that it's kind of like dealing with an emergency management situation on a frequent basis, whether it's weekly or monthly, depending on what's happening or evolving with the COVID situation, we're forced to use those principles that we would have previously used just for emergencies on a more frequent basis, and it forces us to work together. And I think it's helped us to open the lines of communication and work better together more frequently, knowing who's where, and just building those partnerships across the board.
And there's obviously a flip side too to the more frequent collaboration and availability of personnel at all times, in that other long-term planning initiatives don't necessarily get done because now everybody is aware of every fire that's occurring wherever it's occurring. So there's a lot of management that I'm sure is necessary in order to prioritize those different items and make recommendations. But that's fantastic points on collaboration. I wanted to, I'm going to shift a little bit here because of just some of the items that I'm hearing in the supply chain, right? So, law enforcement period in this industry, as we've been approaching it for the past couple of years, has a unique culture in a we will get it done culture, right? Agents and officers will get it done. No matter if they have the assets or they don't, they will find a way to get the mission done. Now that's great, but it also poses significant other problems when you're trying to manage those assets, when you're trying to forward plan and ensure they actually are able to achieve everything that's needed. The supply chain reductions and challenges and slowdowns that we have seen as a result of reduced international shipping and domestic shortages, has had, I'm assuming, a very big impact, or at least an impact on each of your agencies. If so, or could you talk about some of the challenges that you've seen as a result of a slowed down supply chain? And we won't have to go in order here. I'll just say whoever wants to go first, and how you've dealt with them, with the supply chain shortages, and ensuring that agents and officers are able to fulfill the mission. All right, Nikki.
Well, I was just going to mention that I think that some of the questions that you asked previously about collaboration and coming together, I think that because of those shortages and the priority of the pandemic has forced people to work a little closer together and rely on each other for helping them out when they're in a bind. I mean, we've all faced some supply challenges, even with PPE. I mean, we were waiting on gloves and masks and all of these other things, which forced us to reach out to our, sister agencies to say, hey, can we borrow this and we'll pay you back that? I mean, that is a great example of collaboration where the agencies came together to help each other out, and it did build the network. I think, at least for me, I was able to achieve a lot more connections and contacts that maybe I wouldn't have gotten through that process. And now, if I do a favor for someone, obviously, if I need something from that person, they're going to be more apt to help me out in the long run. So I definitely would say that was a benefit, but the challenges, it is what it is. I mean, I think we're all still facing a lot of those challenges when we order things and they take a year to come in or whatever, but it's forcing us to be creative and innovative in how we handle those solutions.
Perfect. Thanks, Nikki. All right. Charlie has gone off mute next, so Charlie, we'll turn it to you.
All right. So we some of our supply chain challenges are just kind of showing up, right? I mean, we all had issues with PPE and all that kind of stuff. But for example, one of the things that drove was, let's dump a whole bunch of money as fast as we can, whether we need it or not, because we don't know how long this is going to last, right? So it became a competition probably across law enforcement agencies to compete for buying masks and everything else with healthcare workers, with local and police departments, with all the other EMT type services. So it really it creates havoc and chaos, like buying toilet paper at Walmart, right? So that's a challenge when it comes to the fiscal part. But directly on a real estate asset part, I've got 4 projects right now already delayed due to not able to get supplies and materials. Some of them are more critical than the others, right? I have fire alarm systems and things like this that just can't get the parts anymore, and our buildings in many cases are pretty old. It's not like we do a great job at life cycle management on those assets, because they're such high dollar, $200,000 investments, $600,000 investments every 7 years, right? When you got everything else competing, and you have, like us, we have almost 300 buildings, right? So to go in and replace a fire alarm system, you don't do it every day, right? So you do it when you can, trying to do the best you can with life cycle management. So you come into this environment and you can't get the parts to fix it, creates a serious problem, which then affects, how you're going to address stuff. but also the labor shortages are killing us. We can't get qualified applicants. That's a challenge. Then the other piece that kills us is, well, that's why we're actually relying more and more on contractors than we ever did, right? And we're hoping they can get the labor, right? They can't always do it. They have the similar challenges, right? But then the other piece, particularly on the real estate arena, is where if you look back at the trends, a lot of people left some of the big cities for better lives in the country because they're going to remote work and everything. And they went down to the south. They wanted to be by the beaches. I have facilities down in the nicer areas like Charleston, southern areas coming from the north. I can't find real estate right now. I've done 6 market surveys to build out a new field office, right? So we're having to come up with alternatives, like can we lease land and put modular buildings on it? Those kind of things. So our biggest right now stuff are related to our facilities assets, but I have no doubt that our other supplies are going to be starting to get affected. I mean, some of our things, like how we do weapons and things like that, they probably not so much, right? But because we have such a long lead time. But some of our other daily kind of stuff that we need, our vehicle fleet, we can't get it takes us, we got 15, 16-month delays and more on getting vehicle fleets and the parts to upfit, right? So they're starting to be seen, and soon we'll have a pretty big impact with the supply chain challenges. We've been able to mitigate them. It's easy to mitigate 5, 6, 7 things. You start having to mitigate 10, 20, 30 things, right? That's a serious problem that we're going to run into to actually have our agents ready to be out on the streets, which then creates bigger social problems, right?
Yeah, I think you hit across multiple topics, and pulling in the housing market and the changes and quite frankly, some of demographic changes and across the United States, having individuals sort of move to better weather with remote work capabilities, greater competition for resources, and that it's downstream effect for the facilities that are being utilized to fulfill the mission. I don't think a lot of people have realized the ecosystem of relationships that relate to that go back to asset management. So that was fantastic. All right, so this is a free for all. So if anyone wants to weigh in on that, I think.
I was just gonna more or less echo what, because that's the first thing that came to mind, what Charles mentioned last was vehicles. I think that was a major hit, I guess, both on the personal side and on work side, where those delays, I think at one time it was like not just the parts, but it was just like the computer chips. So they had vehicles there, but couldn't complete it without some computer chip that was delayed, and it affected everyone. And so what do you do in that, because that vehicles are needed for the mission to be achieved. So what do you do in that case? Okay, so you keep the old vehicle that you have, get it fixed up. Okay, you go try to get it fixed up, but the parts you need to fix it, that's been delayed. So it's like whatever turn in every aspect of our lives and work, that shortage, it affected us. I'm not a Walmart girl, but I was a Costco girl. And I was suffering for a couple of months with no tissue. But so in every aspect, it did affect us. And it was just one of those things as you just have to plow through. You have to just go through and try your best to, I think it was said already, to mitigate those challenges, try to resolve them as best you can. And that only comes by that collaboration. I guess you're forced in that arena to collaborate with your other counterparts.
Perfect. Thank you, Kimon. And Francita, I saw you were going to go off mute, and then we'll have one last question that I'll put out to the group.
Yeah, I'll be brief. So just adding to what was already said, I mean, ditto. And I would just also add being resourceful and finding solutions for those gaps where they exist. So if you could extend the life of a product, maybe ask, well, why do we need to print these cards every year? Can they last? Could we just put out a memo and say, effective until 2025 when these chips finally come in? Or, is there another way? Can we find other solutions to extend the life of existing products while we wait for the new stuff to come in? Or, dig in the archives and see if we could use something that we had used before as a potential temporary solution to fill those spaces. So I think this is something we have to prepare for, though, across the board, because it's still happening, still waiting for products. I mean, things that we ordered over 2 years ago were still delayed, and there's no projected completion date for the order. So we got to continue to think outside the box to get those things we need.
Yeah, I don't think people realize the interrelated nature of the supply chain. And chips are obviously something that's in the news quite frequently. But I remember years ago when a tsunami had hit northern Japan, and it actually took out a plant that made a certain color that was used in the white paint of vehicles for most American cars. And that actually resulted in a backlog in the supply chain for vehicles, getting to the States. So a lot of unique aspects there. All right, a question was submitted by the audience. Can you all speak to advancing resilience and equity through better asset management, specifically stakeholder engagement and equitable level of service delivery? So advancing resilience and equity through better asset management. Anyone want to take that question?
I mean, I'll try for you.
Go for it.
Right.
Thank you, Troy.
All right. So for us, when we talk about advancing resiliency for us, it's all about where do we need the various redundant systems in place. Some of my examples earlier, we talked about we're shifting some of our workforce from a centralized to a decentralized position, right? Well, that's literally because we have frequent emergencies in buildings and things like that we need to be able to respond. By having them here, when we get shut down here for snow or whatever, there's not much we can do for California because a lot of our people won't even be working. So thinking from a resiliency perspective with our workforce and how we position ourselves is critical. I think that's something that we haven't done in the past. We kind of looked at the dollar cost when we centralized everything here in DC. Well, we didn't think about the resiliency, but that leads into more of our continuity of operations program. Part of our planning and everything, we used to kind of like, okay, everything's going to work fine. We're not going to have to do continuity of operations very often. So we do an annual exercise kind of deal. Well, we actually have had to implement it regularly now. So for example, in order to keep the mission going, we used to have one designated facility, right? We would stand up an emergency operations center, working group, all the functional areas, and we would work. So thinking differently, we've actually taken and say, again, let's stick to with the resiliency. And to me, this is a people thing because all of the assets go with all of this, right? So how we've done two things. So first, to maintain continuity of operations, we've implemented a virtual continuity of operations that we can manage from anywhere. Okay, so we can now, unlike before, we can have people in California that have power, that have things going on. We can shift command there virtually to address issues, right? And vice versa. Or we also, because we have people in the different locations, right, they can lead the efforts personally. We manage the National Emergency Support Function 13 law enforcement part for national disaster response. So having alternative supply chain avenues, right, to get our supplies to support that is critical to keep the country going from a resiliency perspective through national disaster. So we're constantly looking who's our primary suppliers and things like that, but we have other alternative backups to where we can with multiple vendors, for example, through BPAs and things like that. So a lot of our resiliency is addressed through contractual mechanisms, right? Problem is, you can't, if one vendor has access to something, maybe they all don't. So our biggest challenge to address it is we can't have big warehouses full of everything that we think we could possibly need. That's cost prohibitive. So we try to strike a balance with what's on the shelf, basically, for what we do. So that's what we can do. For equity, I'm not really sure what the question is related to equity. So if you clarify that, I'll try to throw 2 cents into it.
Well, I think I can help out from the equity perspective. I mean, ensuring that there's adequate resources available to all, and also opportunities that are available to all. And I think you talk about the move from centralization to decentralization, the ability to leverage technology more effectively and remote work more effectively essentially provides an opportunity for a broader network of individuals to work within asset management, to receive assets itself. I think the challenge is in an environment with constrained assets and a reduced supply chain, it's difficult to get resources effectively across the entire ecosystem. So there's a movement away from the ability to do, say, like just-in-time delivery in a supply chain perspective because of the difficulties in supply chain in itself, and then being able to essentially proliferate resources across across the asset management network. Are we?
So let me add to that then. Now that I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Can I go?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so now that I understand what you're talking about, all right. So I think the biggest challenge in government for us with respect to that. So the ESF 13 is a great example, right? It's got a unified command structure. So where we go out, we have multiple agencies. There's 13 federal law enforcement agencies, right? We draw from them, right, to respond to disasters. We are also responsible, right, for all of the assets that they need. So from that perspective, we gain equity because you have unity of command. The problem is in government, and you guys probably mostly know this, is we're always constantly struggling with limited resources to do the most we can. So it's a dog eat dog world, right or wrong, right? So you're going to go out and you're going to try to buy. Until one of the things Moshe and I, for example, has talked about in the past is how do we create this network to create a professional development for non-DoD, because DoD does a great job developing asset managers, right? We don't really have that in the non-DoD sector. So how do we develop that, which then allows networking, which then allows things like this to kind of view things from a more national strategic perspective, even though on the emergency response side, right, national response framework, that's there. But how do we take things like that and look at it from a daily operational perspective? That can only come because it's only achieved through the national response framework because of that unity command, specific delegated mission task, focus on one single mission. That's kind of what this ALN, what we're doing here and what we're trying to do with this group is how do we create that culture and that environment to be able to share across this sector only through there, in my opinion, actually developing strategies, collaborative networks, and eventually policies, because ALN has influence on those policies, right? To shape that using some of those crisis tools in, for lack of a better word, these peacetime operations. So I don't know if that helped or added or not.
I think that was a perfect way to end the panel discussion on what we can do to move forward and be more effective, utilize forums like this. I recognize there were additional questions that I think we have to answer After the panel, we'll make sure to get responses to all the attendees. I know that Nikki had to drop, and there are some other hard stops here. So, what I want to do is thank everyone for joining the panel. Charlie, Nikki, Porsche, Francia, John Schneider again for presenting, Kimon. And we'll be sending out the sector asset leadership strategy again to all participants and publishing it widely. And then this video will be made available for future consumption. Be on the lookout for a follow-up where we will bring together additional concepts and discussions around law enforcement asset management and more collaboration and working groups. So again, really appreciate everyone's attendance. Absolutely fantastic insights. I think the best webinar we've had yet.
Moshe, before we end, I just want to make sure we thank our sponsors, Definitive Logic, Onuma System, ABS Quality Evaluations, and ABS Group, as well as our organizational members, of which Grant Thornton is a big one. So thanks again, Moshe, for putting this together, all our organizational members for supporting the ALN so that we can do programs like this and the newsletter. And also a shout out for the upcoming Andrew James Advisory course starting December 6th. If you're interested in some ISO 55000 professional development, again, reach out to AJAG or anyone at the ALN.